Yeah, it's out there as well.
Cool.
There you go.
Okay. Welcome back, everyone. This is talk 2 of our 2-talk series for the Salem Center Causal Inference Seminar. We had a frequentist earlier in the day, and we're going to finish strong with the Bayesian now. Ken McAlinn also did a postdoc with me and with Sam, and he's going to be talking about Bayesian causal synthesis. Ken, thanks for joining us.
All right. Thanks, David. All right. Okay. Well, thanks, David, for the introduction and the invitation. It's been great visit so far. So my talk's on Bayesian causal synthesis for. So we kind of haven't decided on what to call what we're doing. So it's either so in the talk title it's meta inference, but in the archive version it's called supra inference. I originally thought meta inference was a little bit better because meta analysis, that's a familiar term. It's an inference version of that. But then we found out in causal inference there's this thing called meta learners, which is technically isn't meta. So the supra Bayesian is a different notation in the literature. So I was like, yeah, supra inference. But then some people told me I don't understand what supra means. So I'm gonna have to go back to meta inference. I don't know. It's one of those tiny details that no one cares about unless you're the author of the paper. All right. So today our focus is going to be heterogeneous treatment effects. This has been something that people have been interested in for a very long time. So classically, when we've done causal inference, we talked about the average treatment effect, right? So we have a big group of people, and then we split it into 2 randomized, and then we look at the effect of a drug on the effect of the drug on the treatment group compared to the control group. And in that case, you have a bunch of different groups within that group, right? So you have people from different races with different gender, different XYZ, and that heterogeneity gets averaged out in the average treatment effect. And there has been a lot of motivation in the causal inference literature to sort of understand that heterogeneity and then say, why don't we look at the conditional average treatment effect or the HTE under these contexts, so we understand that different subgroups, different races, different genders might have different reactions to drugs or different reactions to some kind of treatment effect or some kind of intervention, right? And I bring up this paper that Carlos wrote with Richard and a few other people in Nature, which has been cited almost 1,000 times already or something. Pretty nuts. So this idea of heterogeneity in data has been kind of big and has sort of seen, I'd say, pretty big interest even outside of the causal inference literature, even though I don't think it has quite caught up with that yet. All right. So in general, we talk about heterogeneous treatment effects. So causal inference typically is split into, I would say, 2 paradigms, right? One is the design-based paradigm, and then it's the model-based paradigm. The design-based paradigm is where you say everything we need to do in terms of estimating the causal effect comes down to how we design our experiments. And if we design our experiments well enough, then we should be able to get an accurate and good average treatment, or not just average, but some kind of treatment effect, compared to the model-based ones where you say that's not enough at sometimes. You can say observational studies, you have to have some kind of modeling assumptions that you impose on the data itself to try to extract the treatment effect. And that 2 different paradigms, I think, are quite contrastive. And a lot of the HTE methods that have been proposed would fall on the model-based side, I would say, right? So we have linear model assumptions, we have nonlinear models, additive models, Bayesian causal forest, which is big in the Bayesian literature coming out of Texas as well, right? All these things are used a lot in the literature, but they're all model-based, right? They're not design-based. They're all saying, given this model structure, we could figure the treatment effect or not, right? And this obviously leads to the problem of model misspecification, bias, and uncertainty, right? And when we do causal inference in a model-based framework, obviously the choice of models and even the specification of models, in the Bayesian version, even the specification of the priors of the model is going to have a big impact on your inference. And that bias and uncertainty in the specification is often not considered for a very good reason. Right? So model selection or model ensembling or model averaging I would say, is not still a big thing that we talk about in the literature. So the question is why? Right? So there's a clear, coming from more of a prediction background, I think there's a clear reason why this is the case, right? If you contrast prediction and causal inference, right? So the main difference is in predictive tasks, you get immediate direct feedback, right? If I have a model or a method I'm proposing, and the goal of that method is to predict the inflation next month, then I only need to wait until next month to see if my model or whatever I propose actually works or not, right? If it doesn't work, then I'll know next month. If it does work, I know next month. You can't really do this in the causal inference perspective because you never actually observe the true causal inference. Right? You never actually observe the potential outcome. So if you get a drug, right, you never actually observe the world in which you didn't take that drug, right? And a lot of the model selection ensemble literature relies on this sort of direct feedback, right? So it says, if I want to minimize predictive error, then this kind of model selection strategy is the best, right? And if you don't have this kind of prediction is good metric, you're not going to be able to build all of these model selection or ensemble methods. And this has been, I think, a pretty big problem. And people have recognized this, right? So, for example, causal inference competitions have been a very big thing, right? So this is the Atlanta Causal Inference Competition. I mean, you don't need to see what it is, but pretty much it's a blinded competition where everyone gets data, and then they submit the causal inference estimate, and then they rank them based on how good the quality is. And effectively, this is the only way we could figure out which causal inference method is good or bad in that specific scenario, right? And I think the general overview or the general impression that people, or general takeaway that people come out of it is that this is from a quote from I think this is a Jennifer Hill's paper, where it says that overall we find that to a surprising degree we could not go beyond the general recommendation of using flexible non-parametric response surface modeling. And that's it, right? There's no one model that does well in every single circumstance, right? And that seems to be a big issue, because if we know that, like, one could argue that the causal BART stuff has kind of been the flagship in that perspective, but nonetheless, not every method, there's no one method that is good for every situation. And if we don't, given the situation that you have, there's no clear answer which method you should use. All right, so I work in ensemble methods primarily. So obviously, given the model misspecification problem, the first question I'd ask is, well, can we ensemble, right? Because ensemble methods work really, really well in predictive tasks. The central bank uses ensemble methods. Machine learning people in like Kaggle, they use ensemble methods. Pretty much everybody who's working on predictive tasks end up using some type of ensemble methods. So we know that they work really, really well in practice. So therefore, natural thing you could ask is, well, should it in principle at least work for causal tasks? Right? The problem is I would say there's at least 3 problems that make ensemble methods, or applying or developing ensemble methods for causal inference tasks, particularly difficult. All right, the first thing is that there's no clear target to minimize, right? So typically, in a lot of ensemble methods that are developed, they either use cross-validation or they use some kind of information criteria. But cross-validation and information criteria, they're both predictive metrics, right? Cross-validation saying, I don't have out-of-sample data, so I'm going to create quasi-out-of-sample data within my in-sample data to mimic this predictive task that I want to do, right? So it's a predictive task. It's not clear at all whether that predictive task of predicting extra data in your data set is actually going to link back to your accuracy of the estimation of your causal method, right? And same thing with information criteria. So a lot of times it's like trying to hit a watermelon, blindfolded, right? It's just an impossible task without any feedback. But this is too much cultural context behind this one. Yeah, never mind. Okay. The second problem is performance heterogeneity, right? And this is somewhat expected, right? If we care about heterogeneous treatment effects, and we're recognizing that one group has X effect while the another group has a Y effect, and X is going to be larger than Y, then plausibly, the model that you're using, one model could be very, very good at modeling the effect X, but poor Y, and vice versa. So you're going to see some performance heterogeneity in your heterogeneous treatment effect. So there's a lot of heterogeneity on top of heterogeneity, right? Yeah. So one model could be good at modeling the population red. One model could be good at modeling the population green, and one model could be good at modeling population blue, the treatment effect. And what happens is, if you just use a basic ensemble method, you're averaging out all those things, right? So it's effectively you're getting the average treatment effect in some sense, because you're averaging out the performance heterogeneity. All right, and finally, there's high dependence on most models or methods, right? Because obviously you're using the same data to build these HTEs, and you're using similar assumptions, and you can tweak things around. They have one version of BART compared to another version of BART. They're different, but a lot of the things that go in and come out are going to be the same, right? So there's going to be high dependence among these methods, and that's going to be a problem going down the road. All right. So my question has been, on solving these three problems, can we ensemble from a more foundationally Bayesian perspective? So from a Bayesian perspective, what is the right thing to do in this context? Right. And this leads to my main sort of research topic, which is on ensemble methods. So let's just assume that some decision maker is wondering about, let's say, the number of attendants in the seminar. Beforehand, they're trying to predict what the number of attendants or number of attendants at a football game or something like that, right? And beforehand they do that, but this decision maker solicits 3 agents. This could be David and Sam and Carlos, right? I guess Carlos would be soliciting the predictions, but it's and each one of you will have some predicted distribution about the number of attendants. We'll just call that HX, right? And then everyone submits their predictions to the decision maker. And it's the goal of the decision maker to bring all these informations together and make a sort of synthesize this information to make inference as a whole, right? And this is something that pretty much every high stakes decision making situations do, right? Talk to any central banker, they'll say, we have multiple models, multiple economists. They all say what next month's inflation is going to be, and then the chairman of the board is going to look at it and then say a combination of these or these things make sense. They never make decisions based on one model, right? So that's pretty much what people always do in high stakes situations, and this is what we're trying to do in this context as well. The problem is, in practice, and this is true for the causal, there's some literature on ensemble methods and causal inference, and this is the same problem that we see in predictive ensemble methods, is usually people do is simple averaging, right? They just take the average of all the methods, right? That actually gets you pretty far, because simple averages tend to do fairly well, right? But a lot of them is going to be ad hoc, and a lot of them tend to be somewhat gimmicky. And that's fine, right? There's a lot of innovative ways to do this problem. It's just that as someone who looks into this, I want a more sort of foundational perspective on how to do these things. So the question is, well, is there a foundational way of ensembling information? And why do we care about foundations? There's a quote from Dennis Lindley that I find always find interesting, is that it says that one should have some sort of overall view of the system, whatever it is, otherwise every problem is a new problem. Right? As long as we have this foundational view, any new problem is just a modification or a extension of the current problem that you're working with. And that's kind of sort of the motif of my research career so far as well, right? So that makes sense. So the answer to this question, is there foundational ensembling information, is a yes. And that's sort of where my previous research on Bayesian predictive synthesis comes in. Right. And Bayesian predictive synthesis pretty much says that given all the predictions H1 through Hj, let's call that whole set of H, what we want to get, right, as a decision maker is what is the quantity Y given all the information that I observe from the other people, the other predictions from other people, right? And turns out the predictive distribution here is a little bit tricky to deal with in the classical Bayes theorem sense, but there is a version of the Bayes theorem developed in the 80s and early 90s that allows you to synthesize information from different agents in a coherently Bayesian way, right? So this, even though it doesn't look like it, is actually the Bayes theorem, just in a modified version, right? And as long as we're following the Bayes theorem from a Bayesian perspective, we're all good, because that's the main thing we care about, right? And in this setup, the forecasts that we observe, even though we observe them individually, by the notation here, it's clear that the assumption that the predictions coming in are independent, because we treat them as latent factors, this is not actually the case. So I'll give you an example. Imagine you have H1 and H2. Let's just call this Sam and David, right? Sam and David is going to give me predictions about the future, and they give me two normal distributions, right? What's inflation next month? David says 2% standard deviation, something, and then Sam says it's going to be 0. It's nowhere going to be 0%, so Sam is wrong. But Sam is going to say it's 0% with like a tighter standard deviation. So the idea of EPS is that I'm going to treat this as a latent factor, right? So first, I'm going to sample from the distribution. So I'm going to sample from x1 and x2. I'm going to put it into my synthesis function, right, which is the specification of y given x. From this, I could learn the combination weights, right, denoted with the betas here, that tries to minimize the information that I observe from the agents and the target that I care about, y, right? The interesting, because I use a latent factor, what I could do is, given this, I could actually calibrate, right? So given this, I get the predictions of the agents given the data and the parameters, which now is going to be a joint distribution, right? So it says calibration set. So now I'm recognizing that Sam and David, although you gave me predictive distributions independently, right? You're actually, have some common information. You have some, use similar models, that kind of stuff. So you're, highly dependent on each other. So yeah, so now I have a joint distribution that takes into account the fact that the combination step. And for the joint distribution, I sample x1 and x2 again, and I just repeat this over and over and over and over again, right? So this is going to help me learn the best way to combine combine the predictions, but also it's going to help me learn the predictions, the biases and the dependencies of the predictions in the first place, because I get to treat them as latent factors, right? So the y given x is a key part here. This is what we call a synthesis function. It's a conditional specification, and I can put whatever I want in this. And this is the great thing about the flexibility of this framework, is that depending on how I specify y given x, I could potentially deal with a lot more problems that this is what I'm talking about. So the foundational view is that once I have this foundational framework, it's very easy for me to think about other problems because the other problems I could cast it within this framework. Sam?
What do you need to assume about alpha so that this is a proper distribution?
Sorry again?
Well, so you want the left-hand side to be a proper distribution,
right?
That's some problem. What do you need to assume about alpha for that to be true?
I don't know. I don't think you have to. There is some conditions here. There is so it's not in the slides because it's a little bit of a nuisance, but there is what we call a consistency condition, which says that given your initial prior about your own predictions and your initial prior about other people's predictions, that they would have to be consistent with that. So the alpha function would have to be consistent with that. And that would probably ensure that it's probability distribution, right? Because on both sides you have probability distribution.
Okay, so there is
some constraints, yeah. Yeah. All right. So so far I've done for the synthesis function here. I could think about time series problems, right? So in the applications I've done so far, I have inflation, GDP, COVID, climatology, and insurance data. All these can be thought of as time series problems. So yeah, so for the synthesis function here, right, y given x, I'll just have a dynamic linear model, right? Dynamic linear model where the weights, right, the coefficients here change over time, right? That's going to capture a lot of time variation in the data, right? So now we have a dynamic latent factor model. Right, and this has worked really well for a lot of time series problems. The second thing that we worked on was, all right, let's think about spatial problems, right? Now, instead of thinking about the time dimension, can we think about the spatial domain, right? And it turns out that if we specify a Gaussian process as a synthesis function, where S is going to be the location of the place, or the location of the observation, you have a spatially varying latent factor model. Right. And this works really well with rent prices and that kind of, or some ecological data and that kind of stuff. It works really well in that domain. So yeah, so far in my own research and even some other people's research, this framework has worked really well in time series problems and spatial problems. The problem is, right, these are all predicted problems. Right? Time series problems, I just have to wait until next month to figure out I did well or not. Spatial problems, I just need to wait until that house is on the market to know if I'm right or not. Right? So there's always going to be a feedback in which I could there's a link between what I want to do and what I'm modeling. Right? This is not going to be the case for the causal inference. Well, initially we thought it's not going to be the case for the causal inference problem. Turns out that there's actually a pretty close link there. So again, there's the three problems. Right? There's no clear target to minimize, unlike time series or spatial problems. There's performance heterogeneity, which that's fine actually, and that kind of stuff. And we'll go through one by one. So what we actually propose is what we call, okay, so let's go through a notation real quick. T is a treatment, it's a binary treatment, right? Either you get treated or untreated or not treated. That's 0 and 1. And we care about what the heterogeneous treatment affect tau. And each agent is going to produce a distribution of the heterogeneous treatment effect denoted by Hj. This is going to be, for this case, let's assume it's a normal distribution with tau hat jx as its mean and Sj squared as its variance, right? So it's a normal distribution denoted by H, from which we could sample Fx. Okay. And then the collection of all the H's, all the breaker distributions that we have, is going to be denoted with mathcal H, just like we did before. So this is going to be the BPS setup. This is the posterior, right? What is y given all the treatment effects that we observe? And for the synthesis function, what we do is we assign this synthesis function. And I'll go through one by one. So the first component, actually, if you're familiar with the BART literature, this should be immediately sort of analogous, right? So because the first component is the prognostic term, which includes the propensity score, right? And the second term is a little bit different. This is the combination term where we actually combine the heterogeneous treatment effects. So if you're familiar with the BART literature, it's pretty much the same as causal BART, right? Where you have one BART component that models the propensity score, and you have one component that models the heterogeneous treatment effect itself, right? Same thing, sort of. So it's analogous in that perspective. They have a two-component model, one prognostic term, second combination term. The combination term itself just look fairly familiar. It's sort of like a linear regression, right? And the heterogeneous treatment effect is defined, or the synthesized posterior heterogeneous treatment effect is defined as the difference between the expectation of the treated minus the expectation of y, given that it's not treated. And that turns out to be the combination term inside, right? Because the prognostic term cancels out, and then t equals either 1 or 0, so that clears things up. All right, and in our paper, we propose using a nearest neighbor Gaussian process to estimate the betas and prognostic terms and so forth. Right. So let's go through the three problems that I said earlier and see whether if this is getting solved, or at least mitigated. Okay, so first, let's go with performance heterogeneity. Right, so as I said before, performance heterogeneity is a big problem with HT estimation, because one model could be good at modeling one subgroup, but maybe not so in the other subgroup. Right. So in this case, we have our beta inside the combination term. The betas are functions of x's because they're Gaussian processes, right? So the beta is going to be a function of x's, and that's going to allow for the difference in the weights, right? So if x is, let's say there's two groups, group 1 and group 0, that beta is going to change based on which group you're in. Right? So it's going to be able to capture that performance heterogeneity, right? Second problem, high dependence amongst methods issue. Well, as we recall, this is actually not much of an issue for us because we're already treating each HTE estimate as a latent factor. So we actually can learn the dependence structure between these HTE estimates. And by that, we are actually being able to deal with the high dependence amongst models. We're not treating them as independent, right? So finally, so this is where things got a little bit complicated. So this doesn't actually solve or even give some solution to the no clear target to minimize, right? Because right now what I'm doing is I'm just trying to fit that model to y, right? And we talked about how fitting the model to y is not necessarily linked to modeling the causal estimate, right? And it turns out there is a nice connection there, but it actually took us a lot longer after all the simulation studies have been done and we figured out it works. We kind of really looked into the theoretical properties of what we're doing, right? So turns out that Bayesian causal synthesis actually produces consistent estimates of the heterogeneous treatment effect, right? That's the main theoretical result that we have, right? That as n goes to infinity, our BCS estimate of tau tilde, the notation, will go to the true tau x, right? That's the main theoretical result. Yes.
Do you need any assumptions on the agents?
Somewhat. It's in the paper. But I'll explain what we actually do here to get there, because this is not a straightforward task to do, because it's not easy. Because the main problem, right, is that this is the HTE, which is the Gaussian process, meaning that this is unidentifiable. Right? This whole thing is unidentifiable. Right? So we're not actually recovering this at all. Or, yeah.
Can I ask you, when you say you fit this in the Gaussian process, you fit like beta 0 of x and beta j of x and f j of x, or are you fitting it all in one go? Are you fitting like 3 separate? Are you estimating each function separate?
Together.
You're okay.
Everything is fitted together. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So what people usually do in this context, right, as far as I know, it's not a lot, is to say like, in at least the Bayesian perspective, it would be like posterior convergence or posterior consistency of beta, right? And then say like, yeah, that it goes to the true beta, therefore we get the right model, right? We can't do that here because this is an identifiable model. So we get nice results, but we don't actually get, yeah, well, it's unidentifiable, so it's a little bit tricky to do. So, so what the solution we came up with, which was to say that rather than prove the consistency of the estimator directly, we're going to prove it through predictive consistency, right? So what I'm saying is that we are not going to be able to prove this guy, tau till the posterior tau going to the true tau as n goes to infinity, but we are able to show that the predicted distribution that we have will go to the true data generating process as n goes to infinity. It's very much time to come up with a question that I can't answer.
Okay. Can you explain this last thing? So you're saying that somehow you have two things which converge in explorable variation. Is that what you're saying? I'm trying to. So no, that's not what you're saying.
No.
The problem so on the right.
So that's
on the left hand side you have the true.
So this is what I'm saying. So given n samples, I'm trying to figure out what the n plus one sample n plus one sample is, right?
Okay.
So I'm doing a sort of not leave one out, but like predicting one step ahead. Okay. And then I'm saying on one side I have my predicted distribution from DCS given the samples that I have in front of me.
That's the right.
That's the left side. And the right side is sort of the true distribution that generates the data.
So is this like a generic statement about all BPS, or is this?
No. This is for this specific. So we do make assumptions about the data generating process. Given I can't recall them exactly in my head, but it is in the paper. So I did, yeah. Right. But the idea is that we could, in terms of the one step ahead predictions, as we increase n to infinity, the difference between our predictions from our given model to the predictions of sort of the true data generating process, that will go to 0. Yes.
Is that more like a monkey?
What do you mean by that?
Do you, based on one side from a prediction, do you think that they are like a monkey?
I do think we assume IID.
Like, do you assume this sequence is extreme at the end, or do you not make that assumption? Do you not make that?
No, I think we do.
Not necessarily assumption, but it's like a Functi of this.
Yeah, but I have to double check the theory. Yeah.
Is there a reason? So is this part of the reason why you use a Gaussian process on each or within this?
That is the case, right? That is the case. So it does turn out that the Gaussian process is the sort of is doing the heavy lifting, right? Not all synthesis methods is going to get you to that, but if you use the Gaussian process, because the Gaussian process is so flexible, right? It does allow you to get sort of under some assumptions, which I'll double check later. You do actually get that nice consistency. So I made a sort of a more intuitive slide for non-theoretical person like me, right? So what we're saying is, imagine two worlds where the world where no one's treated, or the world where someone is a world where someone is not treated, t equals 0, and a world where someone is treated, t equals 1, and then we're doing some predictive tasks in terms of the future. Or in terms of new data, right? And the heterogeneous treatment effect is defined as this, right? Where the heterogeneous treatment effect is going to be the difference between the predictive distributions of yn plus 1 given t equals 1 and yn plus 1 given t equals 0, and that difference is the HTE. And so what I show is that if we know that the red part converges to the truth, the blue part converges to the truth, then as the HTE is defined as the difference between the two, we indirectly get consistency of the HTE itself. Right. So again, so we're not proving the HTE directly. We're proving through the predictive consistency, HTE consistency. Right.
Sorry, what do you mean by HTE consistency?
That the heterogeneous treatment effect, as n goes to infinity, goes to the truth. So this is the whole theorem.
The
right?
distribution of.
Yeah.
It's for any individual, it's the distribution of the treatment.
Yeah. So that's a whole mess, but this is why I don't like putting like theorems up on. But I feel like Sam is going to enjoy reading it. But this is, as you can see, this is a theorem too, right? The theorem 1 is the main workhorse, which is to say that theorem 1 is the one that in the paper proves consistency, predictive consistency under t equals 0 and predictive consistency when t equals 1. Right? And then given that we could show that there's predictive consistency for those two t equals 1 and t equals 0, theorem 2 states if we have that, then we could actually have consistency on the difference between the t equals 1 and t equals 0, which is exactly what we mean when we talk about heterogeneous, or what we mean about treatment effects.
So it seems like implicitly the assumption is that there's an implicit no confounding, right? Is it right? So conditionally, t and the potential outcome are conditionally.
Yeah, I think so.
So you're still making kind of the class. Okay.
Yeah, I think so.
There's
There's nothing. No, I don't think we're
no
deviating far from the usual
adjustment.
like SUDFA and ignorability and that kind of stuff is all there too.
So in the limit of this becomes more like a randomized experiment.
Yeah, that's exactly kind of what I'm trying to ask. Yeah, but great.
That's a good question. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess in that sense, yeah, right? Because what we're saying as n goes to infinity, whatever the y we're modeling is going to be the y under a complete, perfectly randomized control trial as well. So I think that's true. I mean, it would have to be true, right? Because that's the definition of the treatment effect, right? So yeah, I think so. Read the paper though, because it's over there.
So it seems like a good way to market your paper then, right? So that this is more than just kind of within, this is potentially, at least from a theoretical point of view, it's more than just within the Bayesian realm, but
Oh yeah. So we have like nice, so yeah, so this is, I mean, some would argue this is unnecessary from a Bayesian perspective, right? Because as I'll show you later, it works, and that's ultimately what really matters, that it works. But what, yeah, it was nice. It's actually kind of fortuitous, right? Because with my collaborators, I've been working on theory for the predictive components of BPS for a long while. Turns out that we could reuse this in the causal framework only if we're in sort of the Rubin causality framework, right? Because that is a predictive task, right? Under the Rubin causality model, what you're trying to predict is the potential outcome, right? Not given the outcome. So only under that framework does this actually kind of work. But we do have some nice theory backing it, which I feel like could probably be applied further to other problems as well. We just haven't really looked into it. But yeah, no, it's just find it to be an interesting result that we have. Yeah. Sam seems like he wants to ask me a question.
No, sorry.
Yeah. All right. So by doing that, right, we actually have this in this case at least, nice link between what we're doing, which is predicting, and what we want to do, which is to estimate the treatment effect, right? Because at least we're showing that asymptotically, if you could, asymptotically that we're predicting, the task of predicting gets directly connected to how well we actually estimate the treatment, right? So it's not a super clear answer to the no clear target to minimize, but at least in this context, we're showing that when we're minimizing the thing that we're trying to minimize in this problem, we're actually getting the treatment effect that we care about, right? And this is not something I don't think is quite clear in, for example, like stacking, right, where you're doing leave one out cross validation and minimizing based on like mean squared error. I don't think that's quite clear that what you're doing there is actually going to improve your estimation of the causal effect. All right, so we have a bunch of simulation studies, and I'll run through it, and then we could move into questions or whatever. So we ran a bunch of simulation studies. The first one is a very simple simulation study. We have a DGP. It has two components, the prognostic term and the treatment effect. You get, this should be, right, there's A and B on two sides. Right, yeah, there's A for the prognostic term, and B for the treatment effect. Sorry, A, B each for prognostic term and treatment effect, and we mix and match. You get 2 times 2, 4 scenarios out of this. N is 500, and we replicate it 100 times. The agents inner model is going to be the Bayesian causal force. That's the causal BART stuff, basic linear model, and a linear additive model. Under this situation, these 4 scenarios, this is the mean squared error. We highlighted the top 2 models in the results. As you can see, BCS is only number 2 in 2 of the scenarios, but does extremely well in most scenarios anyway. Right. So it works, right? Well, it turns out, right, again, so, sorry, the things that we compare with is Bayesian causal synthesis, Bayesian causal forest, linear model, additive model, X-learner, which turns out to be pretty good, R-learner, which I think is an extension of the causal forest stuff, which didn't work at all, causal forest, which didn't work at all, and then there's CST called causal stacking, which is just picking multiple causal models and then doing leave one out cross validation.
Can you go back to your slide? How do you pick T?
What do I get? What?
How do you pick how is T generated?
I think T is generated randomly. Okay. I'll double check, but
Okay, so it is in that sense. Then it is a randomized.
Yeah.
Experiment.
I think so.
Okay, to the
For sure. I can double check that, but I'm fairly confident that's the case. But I'll double check. But yeah, so interestingly enough, BCF is a great method, but it's not always the best method. Which makes sense, right? And you can actually see when you have higher dimensions in P, it actually doesn't do as well as some of the other methods. But yeah, overall it does really well. And here are the 95% intervals. BCF is great, right? BCF, or Bayesian causal forest, gets very, very close to 95% most of the time, except when you have high dimensions, right? BCS is a close second, but it maintains sort of good quality even when you have high dimensions. And here's sort of a graph of like 2 examples that I have. If I look at the right, we have the mean squared error. BCS is all the way to the left. Yeah, it does really well across the board. If you look at the intervals, this is the coverage probabilities on the x-axis, and interval length is on the y-axis. And because we do 100 replications, I plotted also the 95%, the intervals of those. And then you can see BCS and BCF both do really, really well under scenario 1, P equals 30. But for scenario 3, P equals 90, which is the high dimensional stuff, BCF does struggle. And you can see the struggle by looking at how large the 95% intervals are for these experiments. Here's a quick plot of all the stuff with the 95% intervals of BCS. But most of the methods do fairly well, I would say. Although as you get closer, or as the HT, the true HT gets larger, you get sort of more discrepancies going on. Interestingly, when the HT is is large, we tend to have larger interval length for BCS, right? Which I think captures the bigger effect, bigger uncertainty kind of thing. I think that captures this graph captures that fairly well. Although I'm sorry that the orange and red are probably a little bit harder to discern on the slides. Okay, so that's nice, but that's simulation studies that we built, right? And you should never trust simulation studies that you built yourself, right? Because you could always, right? I could have had hundreds of simulation studies that didn't work, and the 4 that I worked, I reported, right? It could be. So what we did was we went back to the ACIC stuff from 2017. They had a bunch of scenarios. We just picked the 8 hardest ones, right? And this was based on the paper. We're not saying this is the 8 that worked well, right? This is the 8 that was hardest, that was on the paper, and then we used that to replicate. And again, n equals 500. We replicated it 100 times. Same model, same setup, everything's pretty much the same. And this was very impressive. The Bayesian causal synthesis is the best model in terms of mean squared error across everything, right? So this is the bold isn't only the best one. And the 95% coverage probability of BCS is really, really good. It's actually within 2% difference from 95% for this case, even if BCF it sometimes doesn't work as well. It's mostly around 90% in terms of the coverage probability. Sometimes dipping down to like 70%. Again, this is like the 8 hardest scenarios, so that kind of makes sense. BCS though gets really close to 95% really well. Causal forest, I don't understand why it exists when it has 42% coverage. I mean, it's pretty miserable, I would say. But yeah, right. So this is just, I'm not saying this is the end all be all, but we do think that this is a really good indicator that at least empirically, this seems to work really, really well. And here's the same graph that I made earlier. CF, BCF, BCS. BCS is almost always on 95% nominal rate. The mean squared error also really, really good. So yeah, so I mean, this is seems like a good result for us. All right. Okay, and then I have 10-ish more minutes, so I say. All right, good. All right. So that's good. So we also then stole from the Bayesian causal forest paper on the application. We're looking at the effect of smoking on medical expenditures, a bunch of stuff. And well, here are the results that we have. It's nice to interpret. So for example, age and years quit, pretty much, or at least with age, the HD estimation between BCS and everything else, pretty consistent the same. You see a pretty big difference between BCS and everything else for the smoke age, as you can see. But that kind of makes sense, right? Because the smoke age is, smoke age was, oh, did I copy it wrong? Smoke age is, I think, when did you start smoking? Right? So there aren't a lot of people who are 60 and above who started smoking at 60 and above. Right? That's not, usually start when you're young. So you see a lot less data, right, in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And you see that, right? And you see that uncertainty sort of difference, not uncertainty, you see that difference between all the other methods that we consider, right? And if you look at the weights between the models of BCS, this captures as well, right? So the intercept, right? Remember there's an intercept in the BCS combination component. The intercept is going to capture whatever uncertainty the rest of the models can't capture. So I call it model set uncertainty, right? So the uncertainty all the models can capture gets captured by the intercept. So the intercept is a good indicator of how much uncertainty there exists as a whole, given all the models that you have. And as you can see here, as smoke age goes up, the intercept skyrockets up, right? That's because there's a lot more uncertainty in there. That captures that well. The age and years quit is a little bit harder story to tell. I'm sure if you ask someone who works on this data more specifically, they'll give you maybe there's more good interpretations that can be done there. But from our perspective, this was kind of nice enough to highlight that BCS is capturing what it's supposed to capture, including model set uncertainty. And you can see like a change in model, right? So that's the performance heterogeneity I was talking about. That depending on the X and where you are on the X, right? You can see different performance. The best model is not always the same across the board. Right? That's nice. All right, so this is sort of where my talk's done, but recently, so we got a little bit interested in a small N study because of an experiment that we're running. It turns out, this is probably not super surprising to sort of the BART people, is that when there's small data points, there's not a lot of data points, something as flexible as BART doesn't fit as well because you just don't have enough data to fit a flexible function. And you actually see that in small data, right? So BCS doesn't always do well, but the additive model actually does really well because of its strong restrictions on the form. But BCF actually does fairly poorly in this situation. Right? This is rather an important point, right? Because you really don't know, given the scenario, given the context that you're in, how many data samples that you have, which should you use, right? Clearly, BCF shouldn't be used every single time, everywhere. I mean, unless you're very good at tuning it, right? Sometimes something as strict of an assumption as an additive model actually does better in certain scenarios. BCS is able to capture the difference in those scenarios well. You perform at least as good as whatever is the best, and sometimes a lot better. And that you can actually see here. And you can see that the additive model actually has very, very poor coverage probability with 67%, 71%. BCS does recover the correct nominal percentage, like around 95%. So finally, we've been running this experiment, which I find very, very interesting, with some economists. They are interested in they're interested in reactions to patent waivers. Right. So remember with COVID, they waived patents for vaccines, and so we built this big experiment where we're asking R&D companies, R&D startups, whether the fact that countries are doing patent waivers, is that going to affect your motivation to do research? Pretty much, right? And we only have 80 data points. Right. We asked like 1,000 companies. And like maybe 10% responded. So like it's very small N, right? And then we're looking at the heterogeneity between people who do applied research and people who do more fundamental research, right? And it turns out that with our result, we should say that applied research a little bit of downward motivation, but not significantly. But people who do fundamental research actually got more motivated, right? After the patent waivers. I don't know why, but they do feel very, very motivated to do more research after that. And if you look at the difference between the applied research and the fundamental research, there's a significant difference there. And that's something noteworthy we could talk about. But if you look at the basic causal forest, it's pretty much a straight line, right? It's pretty much a straight line, which means that it's not capturing any of the heterogeneous the treatment effect in this case. And there's a lot of reasons why that could be, but it could be that there's actually no effect, and we're actually capturing noise. But it does seem like under these contexts, given a small N, more flexible methods do struggle a little bit, and this kind of is a good example of that. All right, so just to wrap up a little bit, so our basic idea is that we want to estimate HTEs, but HTEs have model uncertainty, model misspecification associated with it. So we've developed Bayesian causal synthesis that unsolves these HTE estimates. It improves accuracy and mitigates uncertainty. It captures the performance heterogeneity as we wanted. It learns, typo, estimation dependence, and we actually get nice theoretical guarantee in terms of the consistent estimate of HTE. And there's a lot of directions where we could take this, including the application experiments that I talked to a little bit. But as I said earlier, when we were thinking about if we want to call it meta inference or super inference, I mean, one clear application we could think about is, can this be applied like meta-analysis more in general, that kind of stuff. And so we're kind of excited about this direction of research. Here are a bunch of papers, including my earlier works that I've cited in this paper. But the paper on Bayesian causal synthesis is now on archive. We archived it just for this seminar. It'll take until next year if it wasn't for the seminar. So good. But right now we're also trying to develop at least some kind of code that people could use, ideally with all the underlying models as well. So you just press one button and it'll get you the BCF linear model, additive model, and then it'll combine them together to give you the BCS outcomes pretty much automatically. So that's kind of what we're working right now. Yeah, that's my talk.
Questions? Very cool.
So, okay, so if I understand, sorry, you're learning distribution. You're learning the distribution of treatment potential outcomes and distribution of control. Potential outcomes. What, I guess, can you push Bayesian synthesis procedures to not just learn distributions, but to learn the individual treatment effect? Because I guess I'm just trying to. So you did show I think in the simulation or not in the real data analysis that last. You are learning
For each
individual treatment effects. Yeah. But I'm thinking that so I'm just trying to square this with the theoretical statement that you made, that the theory says that you can learn the distribution, but it doesn't say anything about the individual. Is that?
It learns the function tau x.
Okay.
Right. So I think that would include.
Okay. So that would include the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'll double check that.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you again.